I've heard it described as a volcano that's about to erupt, a hurricane, like slow dancing, barefoot on broken shards of glass, like trying to hold back the ocean with a broom. War, the plague, like being drawn and quartered. These are just a few examples of thousands of metaphors I've collected about conflict. What's conflict like for you?
A conflict is when we don't agree or get along with someone. Conflicts can be big or small. Sometimes people can resolve or fix a conflict by themselves, but sometimes they need help.
In a world that's constantly telling you how wrong you are, we want to tell you what's right with you. David McKnight is a counselor, speaker, and consultant who helps people discover how they're wired as a person. His concepts have revolutionized how people see themselves once they learn the principles behind what's right about you. Here now is David McKnight.
David, everybody has conflict, yet so often it's one of those areas that we just don't know what to do with when we're in the middle of a conflict. And you talk about conflict in light of the fact that what's right about you. So when you think about what's right about you and conflict, what does conflict do to illustrate what's right about you?
I do believe, first and foremost, that there's something right about everybody. That they've been designed with the way they behave best, and it's unique to them, and it's right, it's good. But if one does not understand the context in which they're exhibiting their design, then you can have problems. So in the area of conflict, many people don't have a plan for when that happens, a way to approach things. So organizations don't have a plan when things are going wrong. And that's why oftentimes you'll see things start to blow up. And people need to have a way to realize that conflict's not really a bad thing. It's how you handle it that's the problem.
When I was talking to you off air here, you corrected me because I said conflict will sometimes draw out the best or the worst in a person, and you said no, it will bring out their design.
Yes. So when a person feels tension, is backed into a corner, there's a reptilian response, which is to fight back. But you generally come with what you do best. You don't bring your weakness out when you're backed into a corner. You bring out your best stuff. So it's best to understand your best stuff and how you're going to approach it so that you can moderate your behavior to match the situation. My daughter is fascinated with her desire to she wants to be a lawyer, and she realizes that she has this real strong competitive edge. And I said to her, that will work very well with you if you're in the arena where competition is needed. But if it's in your relationship with friends or your husband or other people, and you bring that competitive edge in, you're going to get in trouble. She's got a natural desire, and in the right place at the right time, it's wonderful. But when the situation doesn't call for that, you have to manage that urge to strike back or be competitive. Again, I've said this before, a pitcher who has a 100-mile-an-hour fastball, it's great if that's what the situation calls for. But if it doesn't call for that and they throw it, then they can get in trouble. And we all have that ability to bring out our design in the situation. So it's always good to ask yourself, what's really going on here and what do I need to do about it? And maybe I need to bring my best stuff or someone else needs to bring theirs. So the design is very much a part of any conflict, and understanding the design, your own design, so you can moderate your behavior and begin to listen carefully to what's being said to you.
Okay, so let's unpack conflict for a moment, because I think we'll talk more in future podcasts about how you're designed. But let's say you kind of understand your design.
Yeah.
So what's conflict?
Yeah.
You state there's 5 levels. Let's talk about those.
Yeah, there's 5 levels or tension that we can have in an organization or even amongst in relationships. And the first level is simply a problem to solve. We now have a major problem or a problem, an issue to solve. And there are real differences that exist. Participants, people need to be focused on the problem, and language needs to be clear and specific. But if it doesn't get solved at that point, and this is where managing yourself is important, but if it doesn't get solved there, it will gradually move to what's called a disagreement. And there the major objective is to protect yourself, to come out looking good. So language begins to change and gets more generalized, and we're personalizing the problem, and we start to hold back information. And if that isn't, you'll come to some resolve at some point within that, it will extend itself and grow to what's been called the contest. And that's where the language now begins to be really much stronger. You magnify the problem, there are overgeneralizations made, and assumptions are beginning to be made about the other person. And you're not able to share your feelings, and factions begin to emerge out of that. I've done a lot of church mediation, and pretty quickly you get factions and you get people choosing sides, and people have kind of forgotten what the original problem to solve was. Now it becomes more about the opposing people.
It's a little bit like our political scene, right?
Yes.
So every part of this level, I know you've got a couple more levels to go,
Yeah.
but when does the emotion start right at the beginning, or does it build, or how does that work?
Not always at the beginning. So if you're in a relationship, say a husband and wife, and you get a pattern of how you solve problems, emotions can flare right off the bat. You can skip the first two and you're right to the contest level. And that begins to wear each other down, and that's when things start to dissolve and become almost impossible to solve because you're in a self-protective mode. And there's a great fear in that contest mode of sharing your true feelings. And so you want to really pull back and hide. And an intervention it's needed at that point from someone on the outside. That's where counseling comes in, or consultants come in that can begin to neutralize the situation and get people to go back and see the original problem. So I will often have, my question will be, when did the two of you first meet? And take me back to that first time so that we can begin to say at one point there was ground that they both stood on and it worked. So I've seen that situation in a number of situations. I had one situation where it was in a very large church and two of the associate pastors would not speak to one another. So I was asked by the HR committee, will you please work with these guys? So I got them in a room and began to have them talk. And so I did ask them, so when did you guys first meet? Well, they said it was in the parking lot when the one guy was hired, and they talked to one another, and someone said something that the other one didn't agree with, and it never got resolved, and it got to the point where they weren't even speaking to one another. But when we went back, this is where going back to solve the original problem, they got that out on the table. By the end of that meeting, they give each other an embrace and hug, and they're still working together. But we had to go back to the problem-solving stage to get them to see what really took place. Not everybody wants to do that. They're hanging on to their position and starting to demean the other side.
So then you got two more.
Yeah.
So where does it go from the contest
Sure.
that goes into what?
Well, at that point, people begin to threaten to leave. So I call it's not my term, but it's fight or flight. So if you don't change, I'm out of here. And those threats are quite often in the workplace, in any organization, you hear that kind of talk. And that's when things get real serious if we're trying to hold things together. And people, so factions solidify, you get strong leaders emerge, or if it's just two people, they dig in at that point. Parties will push their own will at the expense of the whole issue. I was in a mediation once in another church situation where the senior pastor and the attorneys in the room and the senior pastor said, I'm willing to bring the whole church down over this situation. So he was going to blow up the whole thing because he was going to hold to his issue. Well, by the end of the day, they saw a different picture, but we had to take them back again to that first stage. What's the original problem here? And worked our way back slowly. Well, it took us all day, but we were able to do that to resolve the issue. But if you can't, then that's usually when people are let go and fired. And my wife's an attorney, and she often says, a lot of my cases would just be solved by a simple I'm sorry. But the I'm sorry never comes and ends up costing 6 figures or more. And it's simply the problem needed to get solved at the problem-solving stage. So then if it doesn't work at the fight or flight stage, then it moves into what I call, it's the intractable stage, or I win, you die. We are out to destroy the other. And there's no clear understanding of the issue. Personalities have now become the issue. Parties display themselves to outsiders as larger than life in their terms. Since the ends are all important, any mean will justify them. And we can see that in politics today. We can see it as we get more and more divided because we lose sight of well, what's the real issue? What's the real problem we're trying to solve? And that's why I go back to design. I'm listening to people talk. What are the active verbs? What's the subject matter? And that gives me an indication of what's important to them. It's very often people will come to me, afterwards and say, well, thank you for understanding me. And all I did was parrot their own words. And that's why words are so important, the words we use.
So I have a sneaking suspicion, just based on the last two anyway, that there are certain kinds of conflicts that just are not solvable.
Yes.
But before you get to the point where they're not solvable, do you bring them back to a point of this is how you are designed and this is why you're reacting in such a way that is causing this impasse?
Situations where I'm able to do that generally can move to a good situation, where people begin to step back, take a look at themselves, take a realistic look at the other side and the designs that are on display, and get an agreement. And that generally gets us to a place where we can simply solve the problem. Case in point was a case where I had been asked to come into a problem at the U.S. Army, where a general had given two E-13s a responsibility to come up with a plan back in the Iraq War came out for being ready, war ready. So it had to deal with families and soldiers. And 5 regions of the country were each given that command. And I had two women at that point who were in charge of this job description, but they couldn't agree and they weren't working out. But then I got them to agree to look at themselves, see what was right about each one, what they brought to the table and what they were best at. Then they began to agree, and then they began to start to work together. One could tell you the time, the other one could tell you how to make the clock. And so they were just going back and forth and calling names to the other. But then we realized, yeah, I'm good at clock making, you're good at telling the time. And so they went on to come up with a plan in Atlanta for the U.S. Army that was agreed upon. But it started out in a conference room where it was chilly and they weren't speaking when I first met them. But we were able to identify what was right about them, what their design was. Now, I've had situations where it was already at the intractable stage and people weren't listening to or had any desire to understand the other side at all, because they were right and the other side was wrong. And I could never get them to take a look at individually what they were bringing, because they had so demonized the other side that eventually I had to pull leaders out and actually ask them, you better go before you have a heart attack, because it was that serious. Because the leader had gone to the hospital twice thinking he was having a heart attack. He was carrying nitro pills around, and at that point I said, it's not worth it. I saw there wasn't going to be any coming to an agreement.
Sometimes you were talking about, sometimes we have a tendency of demonizing the other. That way it legitimizes somewhat of the conflict, at least for us. But sometimes in the church, let's just take Christians who have a conflict, sometimes they hide behind some kind of pseudo-Christianity or spirituality that they really don't really let their inner feelings out. So they never are healthy in a conflict. In fact, that's why they avoid it. Yeah, correct or not?
They avoid it at all costs, generally. Believe it or not all men and women in leadership in the church are self-aware. And it's part of it's due in part because churches set themselves up. They put the pastor kind of on a pedestal, or she on a pedestal, and they have the sense that I've got to come up with all the answers. A lot of pastors are very lonely people, and so they're protecting of themselves. It takes a lot of work when, in essence, the roof is on fire in a religious organization to put the fire out and come back to the original problem and solve it and move forward. Because they do want to obfuscate it. They do want to spiritualize it. They say they're going to pray about it, but they don't. That's just that's a way to blanket the whole thing and not deal with not getting back to what's the original problem to solve. And unfortunately, churches that have a plan recognize that conflict is part of their life. They can work through it. And then you've got a lot of personalities involved. You've got boards with their own individual designs, and people don't talk in leadership roles. They talk in the parking lot, but they don't talk around the board table because they don't feel safe. And that's a whole other issue in the whole area of conflict. I don't feel safe, I'm not going to talk. But a leader needs to recognize this is not a safe place. What do we need to do to make it safe?
That's a great point. But David, if you're going to be a leader today, whether it's in the business world, in the nonprofit world, or in the church, as a leader, you're always going to have conflict. You're always going to come against another person's idea, emotions, or whatever. And so how do we start becoming better at dealing with our conflict? You've given us a kind of a roadmap to what happens.
Yes.
But what do we do with it? How do we become like exercising and getting your body in shape? How do we get our conflict resolution in shape?
Well, I think we have to realize, going back to this mental image, if you can, of the three spheres, leadership is going to do something. Leadership generally creates transformation and creates change and moves an organization forward. And when they do that, there's going to be rocks thrown over the fence. There's going to be disagreements. You're moving people from where they're nice and comfortable to someplace different. And so change will bring about conflict. But if a leader understands, well, that's just part of the process and I have a plan for that, generally things go pretty smoothly. But leadership that doesn't understand that and want to whitewash it, this is, you put in a budget for an organization. You have to put in a plan for what happens when we change things, and there's resistance. Resistance is a natural byproduct or blowback from change. It's just there. So you have to begin to understand the components of change, and there are various steps that happen in order to do change in a way that things work properly. So when change happens, how do I work people through the conflict stage? And that is, you're asking people to change. And people have a natural tendency to not want to change. Even though things aren't very good, don't ask me to change. And so there you'll get resistance, and you just need to know that that's part of the leadership role. Leaders need to understand that goes with the territory. Some leaders can handle that really well and have a plan for it, and it's fun to work with somebody who understands that and can move us forward and keep the team together. And then we've been with leaders that don't understand that and argumentative and resistant, and then you get into the whole stages of a conflict. And it goes back to what we didn't talk too much about, was the different spheres of conflict. So what's really the issue? What's really the problem? Is it a relationship thing we got here? Is it values? Quite often when I'm working with a church or even with an organization like Wells Fargo, working with some people there, the issue was values and upholding the values that were stated versus upholding the values that were being played out. So I had an individual who I was working with who values were extremely important to him. And so I sat down with his supervisor and laid out his concern and his issues. And she said, he's absolutely right. So I'm going to put him in charge of holding us to our values. Well, that calmed things down. He was happy because then he could bring his best stuff, his design to the table, and she honored it. She affirmed him, and she gave him some significance. But had the supervisor resisted that, didn't see his design was involved in this situation, it could have eventually been pretty destructive, or people get fired or left with bad feelings. Hold a grudge, and they pocket it away, and it never goes away. It will come out somehow, someday. So my issue is, how can we go back to the original problem and solve it?
David, it's been your premise that there's something right about everybody. In fact, it was such a conviction of yours that you started an organization called What's Right About You. I love that title. So what is What's Right About You? What exactly do you do?
I think I first began to recognize there was something right about me back in 1983 when I was with a consultant and went through a process and began to see components of my own design and saw them being played out over and over and over again. And so for a number of years, I referred people to that consultant and that organization to get confirmation of that. And so I've been at this now for 25, 30 years almost. And so I began thinking, I need to let people know that there's something right about everybody. And I've interviewed hundreds of people, been in a lot of situations, fun and some pretty heated, but there was always a design at play. And I just want people to understand that. And so I thought I need to kind of bring my body of work together, wrap it under the umbrella of what's right about you, and then be able to help people, whether it's a conflict or whether it's a new job or it's getting people to work together or creating teams or helping an organization start and get off on the right foot. It all goes back to the individuals involved and what's right about them.
If you would like to know more about what you've heard today, you can contact David McKnight. by calling 612-990-6604. Again, that number is 612-990-6604.